Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 6. As you probably know, this week we are going to talk about social and emotional learning and how it relates to educational equity. So, it's helpful first to just sort of get a sense of what do we mean when we say social and emotional learning. And I think most of us know this, right? It's what we talk about all the time. So, self-awareness, which is the ability to accurately recognize your own emotions and thoughts and how those emotions and thoughts influence your behavior. So, your strengths, your limitations, your confidence, your growth mindset, your the accuracy of your self perception, having it come through less of a filter. Social awareness. So, being able to perspective take, being able to empathize with other people. And I mean, Castle even says specifically that it has to be people from diverse cultures and backgrounds in your family, in your school, in your community, figuring out social norms, ethical norms, um, taking perspective, showing empathy, respecting other people, um, appreciating diversity, recognizing that your life and your world is better when everyone is not exactly like you. So, self management, regulating your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors, managing your stress, controlling your impulses, motivating yourself, and doing it across contexts, right? Like, doing it in one context isn't sufficient. Setting and working towards personal goals, academic goals. Um, so, like, self motivation, setting goals, organizational skills. This has a lot of those sort of executive function pieces as we usually think of them. So, relationship skills. So, again, this happens to happen across groups of people, right? Diverse individuals and groups. So, like establishing and maintaining these relationships, the communication, the cooperation, the resisting inappropriate social pressure, the negotiating conflict, helping, looking for help, do teamwork, all of those sort of pieces are under this relationship skills umbrella. And then this responsible decision making. So making these decisions um, based on ethical standards, based on safety concerns, based on social norm, based on evaluating what's likely to happen and considering not just your own well-being, but that of others. So identifying the problems, solving the problems, analyzing the situations, recognizing your ethical responsibility in a situation, right? So those are, even at their most base level, these social emotional competencies do start leading towards a lens of equity, right? Um, that it's clear that if we're not talking about power, we're not talking about equity. So, equity oriented SEL, and I'm going to put the PDF that this is from, which is awesome, up in the additional resources. So definitely check it out if you get a chance. It's Anne Gregory, and who was the other person that it's with? Well, it's mostly her, but it looks like Edward Fergus is her secondary person. So she really starts talking about, all right, so sure, social emotional learning, sure, equity, but like, where are we going if we're not actually combining these two? So having and building a consciousness about disparities, disproportionality, and inequity in schooling, opportunity gaps, history of unequal schooling, as well as the present, as we've already been talking about for weeks now. Um, Considering culture. And so she defines this as the beliefs and behaviors of groups that are bound to history and passed down from generation to generation. Yet, culture is not static and it is multi layered. And then these rings of culture can include youth culture, religion, nationality, gender. And so she starts to bring up this idea of ecologically oriented social and emotional learning. So, what happens when all of our SEL work is based within individual students. Like, what gets left out? And when we start thinking of that, we see staff. Like, we know that just because someone's a teacher, it doesn't mean that any of us as educators, and particularly educators occupying any positions of privilege, middle class or rich educators, white educators, cisgender educators, more on that next week, um, you know, educators whose first language is English, all of these things, um, we have our own social emotional learning to do around them because we haven't been taught all the skills. That's not part of what everyone's education has been. Looking at the school culture, we are, you know, deep in these conversations now about where our school culture perpetuates inequity and where it's protective about it. And so, what can we build on and what can we work towards in this process? Um, the greater community culture, the city that someone lives in, the neighborhoods they live in, the state, the country we're in. What does it mean to teach social emotional learning right now versus 3 years ago versus 10 years before that, right? Like, our culture is shaped by the people in it. And so we're also giving our students the skills to shape it towards the things that matter to them. And then current events. So, you know, we're looking at a culture where we're full of school shootings right now, right? That's a thing that's going to impact our students' lives. And we're also in a culture full of police shootings right now, and that's also a thing that's going to impact students' lives. And we look at all of the increase in anti immigrant violence over the last few years, the violence against trans women that we're constantly seeing, the anti Semitic hate crimes that we've been seeing. Like, again, our kids' lives in our schools aren't happening in vacuums, and our lives aren't happening in vacuums, right? And so, how do we work that in an authentic and meaningful way with kids who are being authentically and meaningfully shaped by it, right? So, when we do this work, we need to consider the culture that every student is living in and recognizing that for a lot of kids, that's a lot of different cultures, right? Even within one student. And what they've already learned about these competencies that we're talking about self awareness, about social awareness, about self management, all of this through the lens of power and oppression. What does responsible decision making look like, right? So, I wanted to start talking about what an equity based approach to each competency looks like. And this is just a starting point, and I'm really interested in whether you want to do it on the discussion boards or sort of what gaps you've seen that I've not been able to identify or fill in, and what we are missing, even when I'm trying to flesh this out somewhat. So we've got self awareness. So self awareness, right? And I want to talk about student self awareness, and I also want us to think about educators. So for this, knowing not just yourself, but also your history and the history of the cultures you're a part of. And like, so I've got this little drawing of this iceberg over here, right? If I didn't draw it, you would not be able to tell it was an iceberg if I drew it. But it's the cultural iceberg, as probably some people have seen, where on the top we have the things that we tend to call culture. You know, we've got our foods and our dances and our holidays and our language, and those sorts of pieces are up here. But then when we're thinking about really knowing your culture and understanding it, we've got all of this. And this is where we get like our body language and our eye contact and our, you know, sense of justice and family roles and understanding of time and, what beauty looks like in this sort of cultural space, and how people engage with their elders, and what people think of in terms of how to make decisions. And so all of this also needs to be a part of social emotional learning for both the dominant culture and the student's culture, right? Um, and so this wouldn't be prescriptive. It's not saying these are the ways you need to be. Like we talked about before, it's not static, it's a dynamic, ongoing, both across culture and across individual sort of situation. But recognizing that is the first step. And then also, I want to think about implicit bias. I know I keep coming back to this, but it's because I think it is so core to all of the work that we're doing. So, teaching students about their own implicit bias, figuring out what's trustworthy, your own knowledge of yourself and your own knowledge of the world. It's not happening in a vacuum, right? It's shaped by power, it's shaped by culture. For people with power, is your sense of yourself trustworthy? Is your sense of the world around you trustworthy? Have you been taught sort of false stories make you, that give you extra sort of belief in yourself and the people that look like you? And if you've been marginalized, like, is this story trustworthy? Like, how are the things that people are saying to you about yourself and the things you've always heard about yourself, do those make sense? Do those match up with your life? As I know for myself, that as a white person, I can't trust that my sense of the world around race is correct, right? Because I have learned for so long on such deep levels without me even noticing these subtle little pieces of racism that teach me to trust white people more. And so I know that I need to step back and not just immediately believe my own brain and senses. I'm a smart person, but this has been broken in me by culture. And at the same time, as a queer person, I also know I can't just trust sort of what society tells me about myself, because I came out in Indiana in the 90s. No one was telling me good things about myself, right? Like, I've needed to find that information outside of sort of mass media and my educational system. And so, an equity based approach to competency lets people sort of see the power at play in their own understanding of themselves and their own understanding of society. So their social awareness is also shaped by this. And same for educators, right? So our implicit bias comes into each part of this. We read that article about how, like, this is coming up in preschool. We read about how this is causing us to be unable, as white educators like me, I can't effectively gauge if I am only trusting my white conditioning. I can't effectively gauge the age of black students. I can't effectively gauge the ability level. Like, all of this has the behavioral skills. Like, all of this has been influenced by all of these stories I heard. So teaching that within the picture of social awareness is essential. Um, and so for students and for us as educators. So how do groups interact across power, right? What's coming up in peer relationships? Whose norms and communication standards are getting conveyed and valued? And further, whose aren't, right? Because things don't have to be totally zero sum, but they are somewhat relevant in terms of what we're not usually just valuing everything equally. And so who's getting devalued when certain people are getting valued? Um, so facing history in ourselves, I assume a lot of you have heard of them, but if not, they're definitely worth checking out. And a lot of what they do is try to support middle school and high school students in engaging in civil discourse. And so um, their principles for creating reflective and supportive classroom community. I'll try to get these up into the resources, but if not, if someone else grabs them and throws them up, I'm sure it would be appreciated. So, facing history and ourselves principles are create a sense of trust and openness, encourage participants to speak and listen to each other, make time and space for silent reflection, offer multiple avenues for participation and learning, and help students appreciate the points of view, talents, and contributions of less vocal members. And so I would say also members who communicate in a way that's different than the one that's been consistently valued in the classroom, right? So I listed on this explicitly teaching code shifting and the reasons for it, like code switching. So I think a lot of us probably have heard of code switching, but it's basically the idea that to varying degrees, all of us talk differently in different contexts, right? Like no one is talking the same when they are complaining about something with their sister as they are when they're complaining about something to their boss. I would assume. But then that when people's sort of core dialect is more marginalized, that code switching between their sort of home voice and the voice of power has to happen more regularly. And for a lot of people whose home voice is a voice that is conveying power, so like a lot of white middle class and rich people especially, they don't really understand the code switching happens. They don't understand the labor in it. They don't understand what's going on. And so really making sure that everyone understands that and that everyone sort of knows the dynamics of place. Um, so I also just want to ask, like, what could a sociocultural and historical orientation add? What could that bring to our classroom? How could that increase our capacity to build socio-emotional learning skills? How could it uh, increase our ability to sort of solve conflict in the classroom and recognize strengths in the classroom? And then how can we harness students' innate sense of justice to build capacity to address inequity and to address those inequities in their schools, in their communities, in broader society? Like what we are doing is we are building a future, right? For students, for our culture. And we know that that's so much of why we're doing socio emotional learning. So, how does that play out differently when what we're talking about is equity? And also, what does this look like for educators' own social awareness with each other, with families, with our students? How are we at all of these questions up here? Because I don't think that this is the thing that we're all comfortable with. I think talking about power in sort of social dynamics is not something that we're taught. And so, what does creating a social school culture look like to make space for that? So, self-management is the next one we want to talk about. And so, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is recognizing your own reactions in the context of historical trauma. So, some of this comes into sort of navigating strong emotions, right? Um, when we're having hard conversations across power and across difference, there's going to be historical trauma that comes up, and there's going to be interpersonal immediate trauma that comes up. And like, how do we both recognize the the need of that student for support, especially in the context of this ongoing corrosion trauma, and also give them the skills to work through it, right? And when is your responsibility to change yourself? When is it to change your culture? And when is your responsibility just to get through something? Um, Back to implicit bias again. How is that shaping reactions, right? We see um, time and time again that often when there is a um, when there's excessive force complaints that against police, the police officers state that they were really frightened, and we know that at least to some degree you know there have been a number of studies that indicate that a piece of that has to do with implicit bias and how our fear reactors are heightened, our sense of danger is heightened across power difference. And so, how can we use teaching self management strategies, teaching meditation, teaching mindfulness, all of that to sort of work through this? Um, and also recognizing the historical benefit that, like, maybe something feels really easy for a certain student or a certain staff that feels challenging for someone else. And maybe the reason it feels easy is because of such long historical benefit. And this can be everything from like reading, right, to um, something like going to the doctor. It, who has had cultural benefit in those situations and who has had trauma? And I think that just looking at the historical trauma side misses a big part of the picture. And then also we think about this as ourselves as educators. Like, what comes up for us? What are the sort of places around power that we get challenged and that we need to understand sort of where things are going to keep coming up for us on either side of it. Relationship skills. I mean, I think that this is just directly connected to everything else we've been saying. How do you have honest and wrenching conversations about power and pain, and how do you do that at all developmental points? If we don't start talking about power and oppression and justice until kids are in high school and injustice, then they have learned a lot about this without us giving them the appropriate support and developmental scaffolding to do so. And so how do we bring ourselves into a space of understanding enough that we can lead these conversations? How do we teach white students to work across racial empathy gaps? If we know that starting so young, starting when they are in preschool, starting before they're in preschool, that both white and black kids are already seeing white kids as superior because of the cultural messaging, how do we work through that? Because those stories are coming before we're ready to respond to them. And how do we teach white kids to build true relationships with their peers of color at this age when they are still young, so that we can maybe start pushing against that racial empathy gap, so that maybe in however many years from now we're not going to have a culture where black people are under prescribed pain medications because white people who are the ones in power prescribing pain medications literally do not believe they feel physical pain in the same way, let alone emotional pain, right? What lenses are people bringing to interactions that impact the abilities to form authentic relationships? So, how are beliefs and value systems that might be happening in implicit ways and might be happening in explicit ways shaping our senses and our students' senses of who other people are and what they can bring? And then, what can truly restorative practices look like? And here I'm thinking about restorative justice. I'm thinking about transformative justice, about the moments where people can truly see each other, truly apologize, truly reckon, and that all of that requires a strong community at its base because all of these circles processes require you to have meaning in this circle, right? And so then also, what does this look like for educators' own relationship skills? What does this leave for us in terms of our work to be having these honest and wrenching conversations? How are we having them in our personal lives? How are we having them outside of work, and how are we having them inside of work? Responsible decision making, and I think that this comes back to power and access and who each person is responsible to and for. And some of this is what we talked about the culture, like how culturally are decisions made. Can a responsible decision be one that is against one's own self interest? And I think we can all be like, yes, it would be in my self interest to steal a jet and fly myself to LA. That would be awesome, especially if like I knew I was never going to get caught. It's not a responsible decision, partially because I guess I could maybe hurt the person whose jet it was, whatever. But also, like, that's super, super environmentally destructive. And there's all of these larger sort of social pieces. So even though something benefits an individual, if it doesn't benefit the collective, is it a responsible decision? And even if something benefits the collective but doesn't benefit the individual and may even in the short term hurt the individual, can that still be a responsible decision? And how is that decision made? And then what about collectively made decisions? Like, and having to go along with the will of the collective. We live in a democracy, right? So that's a thing that we all have to practice. But what does it look like if we get back to me talking about how, like, as a white person, I can't trust that I know what I'm talking about around race unless I hear and listen to people of color and like respect and take in the words of people of color. But everyone of people of color aren't all going to agree on everything. So like, how do those sort of decisions happen, and how can we help teach our kids around that? And then again, as educators, where does this get us? So I'm really interested in hearing uh, your reflection about where you see these sort of core pieces of social emotional learning reflecting or working against equity in your groups. Because again, like, we can have something that works towards diversity but against equity. If all it is like raising people's voices but not critically thinking about whose voices are being raised, then that's not necessarily a move towards equity. And so, what can we do to ensure as educators that our social emotional learning is following that? So, again, the question is, in your schools, in your districts, where do you see social emotional learning currently working to promote or work against the greater goals of equity? And so I just want to read this quote from an article called Forging the Connection Between Social Emotional Learning and Educational Equity from the Committee for Children. I will try to share this on the website also. And they said, at its foundation, equity in education requires a physically and emotionally safe and positive school climate in which students are respected and encouraged by adults who hold high expectations. This culture of achievement saturates all aspects of the school, featuring an environment for learning that is culturally responsive and that challenges adults and students to have a strong sense of self efficacy. In addition, such school climates encourage students and teachers to bring thoughtful debate, listen to and learn from others' perspectives, and disagree with each other as well as adults without fear of reprisal or recrimination. This process is neither clean nor straightforward. Inviting students to engage in justice issues can be messy and fraught with difficulty for students and adults alike. But when student agency is unlocked, including providing students with the skills to follow up with their newfound voices, Authentic engagement is usually the result. SEL cannot solve the social inequities that affect our students. These are structural issues to which all educators must be attentive and about which strong advocacy is needed. While this is taking place at a wider ecological level, by linking SEL to equity in schools now, every day, we and our students hone the skills to become the architects of a better world. And so I really appreciate about this that it's not letting any of us off the hook for the big picture or the small picture. It's not that this is a conversation that only needs to be happening in the larger culture, and it's not that it only needs to be happening in our classrooms. If it's not happening everywhere, it's not happening meaningfully. And there's a video that is in your um, info, the group readings section, whatever the folder for this week, that is not on your syllabus, but that I would really appreciate people watching. It is about a school in Oakland. It's about 16 minutes long, and it's about a school that's really trying to sort of hit this social emotional learning in a really deep way as it goes. And feel free to use that as the thing that you respond to on the discussion boards. Okay, thanks so much. Talk to you next week.